Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao. Today we will be covering two passages. So these two sentences: first, give more and take less, and second, suffer humiliation without grudges. So the first passage, give more and take less, seems rather obvious, isn't it? Because we are focusing on good deeds here. But it's quite interesting when you actually switch the verbs. Imagine if it was to take more and give less. So you can see, obviously, that that would be the cause and the source of much resentment, conflict, and tension in our relationships. And so give more and take less is really the key to harmonious interactions in our daily life. In terms of sort of the Taoist tradition and the theoretical understanding behind this particular phrase, we can turn to the Taoist classic called the Tao Te Ching. And this give more and take less is really to help us emulate the way of nature. As it states here, the way of heaven is not contentious. It's not to compete or contend with anyone. And at the same time, and through this, it is effectively successful in all that it does. So this idea of nature and in the Taoist tradition is to emulate the phenomena and the ways of nature so that we can return to the Tao. I want to sort of address some key words here in this particular line before we move on. As it states, give more, take less. So the key word first would be giving. According to the commentaries, there are various forms of giving that would be included here, although many may think of giving in the form of material support, so through financial support or in-kind support. Actually, there's a much broader scope. So we can give in terms of also our skills and knowledge. So whatever we know, we should give generously in helping people also understand and empower them with that knowledge and nurture others so that they are also able to then pass on that knowledge to others as well. So really it's anything that we can do to help others. Another form of giving that we may not come to mind immediately is that of giving opportunities. So the idea of recommending someone for a position, so career opportunities, but also connecting people together so that, if someone is interested in a particular field or area and you happen to know an expert, then perhaps you could provide a recommendation or provide some form of communication so that this person can be helped. And in fact, when you think about it that way, the giving may not necessarily involve a lot of time and money, but it's just this genuine care for others, for the people around you, and thinking what is in your abilities, in your resources that can help them. So that's the first keyword, which is to give. The second keyword is more, okay? And obviously, there's no specific sum or amount here. It's very much based on the specific situation you find yourself in. Regardless, the commentary tells us that this amount or whatever you're giving has to be within your means. So it's not advocating that you give up everything for others. It's actually giving within your means, ensuring that you can continue your own livelihood, etc. The more may not necessarily be a specific sort of quantity. So, for example, sharing more, providing the larger share of profits with someone else if you're in a business partnership, but also the idea of the quality as well. So it could be that what you're giving is newer, it's the latest model, it's better, than what you have, and therefore, but you're willing to give it up. The other thing that we can give is giving more credit to others. And that's an intangible source of this idea of giving. And also giving and allowing others to go first. Now, this is not necessarily just through a door or allowing someone to go first in a queue, but it can also be allowing them to go have an early appointment. You know, if you've made an appointment and they have a much more urgent need for that appointment, then maybe we could give up that spot. So there's no limit to our imagination, and you can see that this kind of good deed can be, we can do this in every day of our lives. It's just up to our imagination. Now, interesting thing is that in terms of this idea, it doesn't seem to be too hard, you know, nothing too abstract or too lofty. And as I just said, it's quite practical, something that we can do on an everyday basis. But to help us get a better notion of the intricacies of this giving, the talk today is structured in a series of different sort of accounts. The first one I'd like to share with you is quite well known. It's about some friends, so two very good friends who were sort of friends from a young age. And they both came from a particular county called Cixi in the Zhejiang province. They were both studying together and ultimately went for teaching positions. They were both offered jobs, but the offers were a bit different. Now, their names are not actually recorded in the historical texts. So for convenience sake, let's just call them Bob and Peter, okay? So Bob gets a job offer that is 9 taels of silver. Now, a tael is an ancient measure for weight, which is roughly equivalent to about 50 grams in the modern metric system. So 9 taels would be about 450 grams of silver, which is, you know, quite substantial. But Peter, his friend, gets a different job offer. He gets an offer of only 6 taels, so 3 taels less of silver. But it's Peter who actually has a family and also his elderly parents to support. Now, these friends know each other very well. They know their background. They've met their family. Their families get along. And Bob, who got the better job offer, he's very much well aware of Peter's situation. Bob himself only really has his own family, his parents. It's not stated, but it seems that his parents have probably passed away. So, in other words, he feels that maybe Peter should be the one that should have a higher salary because of the needs of his family. And so he willingly gives up that job and you know, asks Peter if he wants to switch so that he has a higher pay. Now, Peter is very, very grateful. And so it is agreed that they switch, which, you know, was fine. And so ultimately, Bob travels to the new position. In those days, oftentimes to start work, one would have to travel to a new place. And in the case of teachers, they would actually have to live at the school. So when Bob arrives in the teacher's accommodation, he finds under his bed a book. It's sort of a little handbook on medical prescriptions. So different medical treatments, you could say, for the everyday person. And sort of wonders who owns this book. And when he asks around, the students tell him that this was formerly owned by the previous teacher who had just left. And they said that, you know, it's really no one's property, really. So He, in his spare time, he's able to flip through the book. He takes an interest in this, and throughout the semester, he's sort of learning it himself in terms of what to do if he had these common ailments. So quite interesting. He sort of develops a bit of medical knowledge. Now, during the winter holidays, he travels back to see his hometown, but on the way home, he encounters obviously some servants who are sort of frantically looking around for a doctor because their master, who's new to the area that he's passed by, has fallen ill and developed these very painful boils on his back. It's been 3 days now, and their master is, completely bedbound, in such pain that they just need to find someone to help them out. But because they're new to the place, they don't know who to look, where to ask, and who to look for. Now, it just so happens that when Bob hears about the case and what happened to their master, he thinks of a particular prescription that he's read in that very book. And so he sort of offers his help. The servants are very happy. They take him to see their master, the official, and ultimately he uses a bit of Chinese mugwort, which is a type of traditional Chinese herb. He uses some moxibustion, and then ultimately this person is cured, fully recovers, no longer in any pain, there's no boils anymore. Now, it just so happens that this person is actually the new provincial administrative commissioner. So in other words, something like a mayor or councillor in those days of that particular area. He's so happy that he rewards Bob with 100 gold pieces. And after they start, conversing, he starts to know a bit more about Bob's background. He realizes that Bob is actually from Sicily, and the whole background as to why he has to travel home, the fact that he sort of switched places with his friend who was in much more need for the high salary, etc. He gets to realize that Bob is a person of great character, and he thinks about how he can help Bob. And so what he does is he realizes that one of his good friends is actually the magistrate, the county magistrate of Sicily, Bob's hometown. And what he does is he makes a recommendation, and with that recommendation, Bob is able to be funded for further studying. Now, in those days, many of the scholars, these imperial examinations, so examinations in order to become a government official, were really a series of exams over. It didn't necessarily occur every year, which meant that investing in a kind of education, higher education, to be able to become a government official was something that might have occurred over decades. Some people might have failed the exam several times, and they had to fund themselves by working as teachers. And this is what Bob and Peter were doing. So they were teaching at the same time as continuing to study for the exams. But because of this recommendation from the commissioner and through the county magistrate, Bob was able to be funded so that he could continue to study for the imperial examinations. So we can see that through just this good deed, this generosity that Bob had, and caring for his friend, the good fortune that ultimately eventuates. And, if we reflect on the story, well, was it really just 3 taels of silver that Bob was giving up, a 30% cut in his salary. Well, it was more than that, wasn't it? Because he was actually giving his full moral support and a genuine care for his friend. And it wasn't just his friend, one person that benefited, but in fact his friend's entire family, including the elderly parents as well, that were helped through the act of kindness. And this is priceless, really, that's something that money can't really, you can't really quantify that. But through his, as we said, his genuine care, he encountered someone else, the commissioner, who was also genuinely caring of his circumstances and sought to find ways so that he could be in his hometown and continue his studies. So these are, as you can see, this giving more, the good fortune of this kind act. Closer to the modern day, have made me think of a story from my friend's uncle, who was based in Taiwan. And when my friend's uncle, when his parents passed away, his siblings decided to divide the property and the estate. He was the kind of person who didn't like to get into disputes. Was just really didn't want to bother anyone, and was the kind of person who was quite happy and quite generous. So he said to his siblings, well, why don't you divide the estate amongst yourselves first, and I'm happy with whatever you leave me. So what did they leave him? Well, they left him with sort of 2 plots. I should have mentioned that the estate was actually farmland, so very arable farmland. But what did they leave him? Well, the first sort of land was a slopey area. It's very hard to grow anything. And then the other bit of land was really just next to the roadside. It was on the roadside. So both of these areas was very difficult to grow anything, to grow any crops. So it really couldn't be farmed as well. So, but he didn't mind, and he was quite accepting of this lot. Years later, while the siblings were complaining about the very high taxation on their farmland, what happened was that his areas turned out to be worth much more. How did that come about? Well, just so happened that a few years later, the government decided to expand the roads, so basically widen the road. And as a result, the government had to buy that land from my friend's uncle. And the government compensated him quite generously, with the result that after having sold the land, that area was actually much more high in value than all of the other farmlands. So you can see that through these stories, you can see that it's through giving that we really receive. And hence, as it says, give more and take less. We receive not by our greed, not by taking advantage of others, but actually by looking out for the interests of others, by thinking about their interests over ours, in the sense that you can see from the 2 stories that these 2, my friend's uncle and the friend, they treasured these bonds over and above the property or the money. So my friend's uncle, in terms of the sibling bond, so he was able to just say, okay, well, take what you want. Let's not get into any disputes or go to court over this. And then the friend who was saying, well, you obviously need this more than me. So, I'm happy to give this up and really treasure this lifelong friendship that we've had, and the friendship that I've had with your family too. So treasuring that bond. And ultimately, the collected commentary to the treatise explains that what we're destined to have, even if we give it away, it's bound to return to us. So you can see, the friend who gave up 30% of his salary, well, he got it all back with the gold pieces and possibly the position, that fully funded sort of position to study more. And with my friend's uncle as well, with that plot of land. On the other hand, if we take more than our fair share and use, unscrupulous means, unethical means to do this, take advantage of others, then this is a misdeed in itself and it will lead to misfortune. So, if it's not something that's in our destiny, then, or, if we don't, are unable to have the right intentions when we're sharing profits or something like that, then this will lead to ultimately misfortune. The idea, of course, is not this how much we give, but in the act of giving itself, that intention, that pure act of giving without thinking about oneself and ensuring that one's concern is for the others. There are a few very interesting stories as well from the Collectania of the way and its virtue. And because in some ways we think about, okay, well, this idea of giving, but how do we go about it? There are different ways. So this text, share this with you. So this particular text, which is an anthology of various stories throughout Chinese history, shows several different professions or trades in which, regardless of the place or the era or the profession, that, in all types of jobs, that giving is possible. So I'm going to talk to you about these three people, and as you can see, they have different jobs and live in different areas. So the first story is about Li Wenda, who is from the Nanyang city of Henan province, and he was a cotton trader. So in this particular story, it talks about how he sold his a fair amount of cotton to 3 merchants who bought it for about 300 gold pieces. So you can see it's quite a substantial amount. And they already paid up front. They instructed him to deposit this cotton at their lodgings. But before the merchants had time to actually pick up that cotton and transfer it, ferry it to their factory, unfortunately, that building caught on fire. And the building, everything in it, including the goods, were completely destroyed. Now, the merchants were completely distraught. They had already paid for the cotton, and they were left with nothing. No money, no goods for which to create more merchandise that they could sell. And having gone out on a limb to buy this cotton, they really had nothing. They were very desperate and actually thought about committing suicide, ending their lives. Now, Li Wenda, who actually heard about this, he thought to himself, well, actually, my situation is such that I could do without this money. I could just be more frugal, work harder, but I can still get by. But look at these 3 merchants, they've got nothing. And so what he did was that he fully refunded the 300 gold pieces. He said to them that, that cotton, it was in that building, but it hadn't really even boarded your ferry. And therefore, in many respects, it was still mine. So it's my loss. And so I return to you the payment because it was actually still my goods. And they were completely, they were so grateful because they could then use that money to then invest in further, invest and actually have continue their livelihood. So you can see Li Wenda completely bore the loss of the situation, even though really it was no fault of either party. On that night, according to the story, he dreamed of two spirits who were dressed in red. They came to him and they said that he would be blessed with a very special child. And the following year, his grandson was born. And the very last sentence of the story tells us that this grandson eventually becomes the chancellor of the Chinese Empire. So this is, very, very amazing. We can see that Li Wendan, that's in this moment, chose to give more and take less, and cut his losses and said that realized that he could continue to get by compared to the merchants. The next story, Yu Yongning. The other story, Yu Yongning, is was man based in the Anhui province. Now, he was a timber merchant, and for many generations of his family, they all sold timber. And so his ancestors all sold timber for living. And so when his county was planning to build a new bridge, they naturally turned to him for his services. And their initial estimate, this is the county, the officials, their estimate of the cost of the bridge was about 4,000 gold pieces. Now, this was the money that they thought they would set aside in their budget. So it wasn't his quote. It was just something that they thought. Knowing that 4,000 gold pieces for a bridge was actually very tight budget, he decided to build it himself with the minimum staff. So he put in his own effort and labor. He immediately set to work on it, and although his wood, the timber that in his business was mainly sourced from a particular mountain, for this particular timber, he sourced out a better quality that was in a different area. So, actually went to, expended much more resources, time, and money on sourcing this other wood. Now, you can imagine that this whole project, this infrastructure project, took months, if not over a year. And by the time when it was finally completed, what happened was that the price of that particular timber that he had sourced had risen, manyfold. You can imagine a parallel would be, inflation today. Head of broccoli, 2 years ago was, let's say, $3, and now it's much more. So it's the same broccoli that you're buying, the same amount, but the price has just gone up. And this was what had happened with that particular timber. So in fact, by the completion of the project, when he was writing the invoice, he could have made a huge profit because when he sourced it, it was X amount, and by the time he wanted payment, then it was much more, it costed much more. So he could have actually invoiced the county for a much larger sum. What did he do? Well, he stayed to their original estimate of 4,000 gold pieces. and in fact decided not to make that profit, but to keep to their estimate. So if you can remember, this was not his quote, so it's not something that he had to abide by, but something that he was told the county had put aside. So really, this particular amount that he charged meant, of course, that the county would be left with more money. And obviously, the government funds were really taxpayers' money, which meant that he benefited everyone in that county, not only with the infrastructure project, the actual bridge, but also his charging of that project. And, what happened? Well, we're told that he enjoyed good health, long life, children and his grandchildren, because he lived such a long life that he was alive to see his grandchildren, great grandchildren. They prospered one generation after the other, and I think when we think about the good fortune, there are different types of good fortune in terms of wealth, a good family, happy family, harmonious family, etc. But on a personal level, of course, our health is our greatest wealth, and this was something that he enjoyed until very old age. So it's just through the kind of person he was, but also is illustrated by this great good deed. The next, and another story concerns a man by the name of Yang Shiyan of Wenzhou in the Zhejiang province. And he was a businessman. He opened up a store that sold rice as well as other grains and cereal staples. So something that everyone needed to buy. But he had a very interesting business philosophy. So in his mind, he thought, well, as long as I don't have any hassles or troubles with the officials, with my suppliers, with customers, etc., then I'm just happy to, be giving to the community. So what he did was that he actually allowed the poor customers to weigh the grain for themselves. You can imagine, of course, that some of them might weigh nearly a kilo and tell you that it was only half a kilo to pay less. And he never argued with anyone, even if they were unreasonable or took advantage of him because of this business philosophy. And naturally, other businessmen called him a fool. How could he just let customers take advantage of him like that and be willingly be cheated in a way? But his sort of idea was that, if I have something that others don't, then I'm willing to actually help them out. And so much so that he would actually give rice to people who couldn't afford it and even give them funds. So during times of drought, we're told, when other businesses would raise their prices, he sold at the usual price. And he didn't sort of take advantage of the desperation of the people. And in fact, in the afternoons, every afternoon when he closed his store, he would walk to the poorer parts of the community and find out anyone who had any needs, so help out the more vulnerable members of the community, including orphans, widows, and even sort of the working poor peddlers. You can imagine that these people, they really sort of make a pittance for their living. So any time that they are unwell, then it's very hard to make ends meet. And so we would help them out with medical expenses, medicines, etc. And this was something that he actually did every day. Well, what we hear about is that the more he gave, the more he prospered. And this is from a financial perspective in terms of the figures of his business. And ultimately, when he was aged 62, he fell ill, and it was actually quite a grave illness, so much so that his consciousness left his body and traveled to the underworld. Now, in the Taoist tradition, we've heard how they believe that there's a bureaucracy of spirits that oversee the human world, that sort of records the good deeds, the misdeeds, etc., of every individual, the family, the organization, community, etc. And it's not only while we are alive, but also after we pass away. These spirits are also there to help check the records and see, what happens next in terms of reward and punishment. So he's in this underworld, and the spirits are reviewing his records, and they see that he has accumulated so many good deeds that they actually increase his lifespan. And we know that in the early part of the treatise, it talks about how, depending on the gravity of offences, then one's lifespan will be shortened by units of 100 days to 12 years. But from the other perspective, if we perform good deeds, acts of great kindness, or accumulate these good merits over a long period of time, then our lifespan will be increased as opposed to being decreased. And so this is what happens to Yang Shiyan. And he's sent back to the human world, where he continues to perform good deeds. And rather than, so his life, he was told, would be increased by 2 units of the 12 years, so 24 years in total. So this is at the age of 68 that he has this sort of encounter. And then, but what happens is that he actually passes away at the age of 92. So, obviously when he, returns to the human life, he's able to continue with his good deeds on a daily basis, and extends his life even further. So passes away at the age of 92 without any illness. And we're told that his descendants were wealthy for generations. Now, his story is quite interesting because compared to the early stories, which were sort of once-off acts of kindness, the cotton trader or the timber merchant who thought, okay, well, in this particular transaction, I'm going to give more to the other party. Well, for this Yang Shiyan, you can see that he was able to give more and take less on a daily basis, day in, day out, not only as part of his job, through the store that he owned, but also, after, in his spare time, he would go and try to help others out as well. So it was part of his job, but also part of his philosophy and his way of living. And what's very interesting is that in the conclusion, in the commentary to his story, it sort of emphasizes the fact that, this giving, how was he able to give so much and on a sustained sort of period, over a sustained period, was because of his contentment. So this idea of sort of taking a step back, seeing, what is it that we have in our life already, being grateful for that, and being content with the fact that, we can continue working hard and earning a living in this way, but also being content enough to say, well, I'm not going to be asking for more. And if I do have more, I'm also willing to share this with others. And really that contentment, it's noted, is the true wealth, the real wealth, the true source of happiness, stability, and this inner peace. And you can imagine that, if we're someone who's wealthy, but they're always thinking they don't have enough, they always want more, and thinking of ways to increase their funds, And compared to someone who might be poor, who's also thinking about, every day how to make more money, how to, get more, and give less, then really the two mindsets are really the same, aren't they? That they're both in a way suffering. They don't have that sense of contentment or inner peace, and it doesn't matter how wealthy you are or how poor you are. If you have that mindset of always wanting more, then it's really the same in the sense of this suffering inside. The other perspective from the Taoist tradition, of course, is that of the idea of not contending with others. And the classic passage in the Lao Tzu, as you can see here, is about water. And the Taoist tradition, that idea of emulating nature, the idea of water nourishing everything around it, but not contending with them, because it goes to the low-lying places, it fills up the holes, etc., where everyone doesn't want to go. And you can see that just in the story of the businessman who had the grain store, that he was not willing, he didn't want to compete or contend with other businessmen. He was just happy as he was, without any sort of hassles from his various stakeholders, officials, customers, etc., and to be content in that way of living. But you might say, well, all of these stories have been about, giving up some sort of property or wealth. Surely there are other forms of giving. And certainly giving can occur regardless of, as I said in the beginning, any profession that we have. There's a really great story about a man called Wang Gao, who was a scholar. And he actually worked as a private tutor, much like the earlier story about the two friends, trying to self-fund for the imperial examinations. Now, on the way to sitting one of the exams, he happens across a fortune teller. And the fortune teller predicts that he won't pass this particular exam. And Wang Gao is quite surprised. He says, well, I've been told that I'm quite talented. I have a flair for writing. So why is it that you're telling me that, I'm not going to pass? And the fortune teller explains to him that it's about one's fortunes. And this fortune is not necessarily just about talent, but also our thoughts and whether we've cultivated merits. Now, Wang Gao asks him, how he can change his fortune, and the fortune teller explains that he has to cultivate good deeds. Now, sort of returns home and sort of wondering to himself, well, I'm just a poor scholar. It's not like I can give a lot to other people, or the poor don't have much time as well. What can I do? And he realizes, well, what if he sort of puts his heart and effort into really teaching his students and helping them in any way he can, so that they can ultimately pass their exams in the future. So that's what he does. And 3 years later, because these exams are, not every year, sometimes every 2 years, every 3 years. So he travels again to the examination center and again comes across this fortune teller. And as soon as the fortune teller sees him, he tells him that he will pass the exams this time. Wang Gao is quite surprised and says, well, how do you know? He says, well, I can tell from that you have this great fortune now. Well, what have you done? And Wang Gao explains, well, I don't feel that I've really done much. I'm just a poor scholar. I've really just been teaching. And then the fortune teller explains to him that, with your teaching, you're helping others to really be of service to society. And, the kind of teaching, the Confucian humanistic education, helping them to realize their innate goodness And this is a really great merit, the greatest merit. Ultimately, as predicted, he ultimately passes the exam. And, you can see that the common denominator in these various the various protagonists of these stories is that, whatever work they did, they tried to do their best in their different capacities. And they, you can ask yourself, well, were they thinking about getting some sort of reward? And I think most of us would agree that, when they were giving, they weren't thinking about some good fortune around the corner or some sort of reward, but they were just doing it. And in many ways, this particular line, give more, take less, is training ourselves to think outside ourselves, to think of the broader picture, others in society, friends, etc. Whoever is in need, thinking more of the needs of others and less of ourselves, and gradually getting back to the greater Tao, or the way of nature. So that's this line: give more, take less. The next line is to suffer humiliation without grudges. So humiliation, a very quick definition would be an attack on someone's character and their dignity. And this can come about through misunderstanding, through blaming other, being blamed, and can often happen even even despite the best of our intentions, and it may not arise through any fault of our own. But you can see, of course, that humiliation doesn't just result in a temporary loss of dignity in that moment of being, attacked and humiliated, but there may be lasting repercussions, consequences for one's career, if you have seen to have poor character, and ultimately your reputation, etc. So then, it would be natural for people to be resentful and upset when they suffer from humiliation. Why is it that the Exalted Treatise tells us to suffer humiliation without grudges? This is where it's hard. This is where the good deed is. So, first of all, if we are humiliated, we have to reflect on ourselves. And, if it is because of some mistake we've made, or poor effort, or poor work on our part, then it's really a wake-up call. And this criticism helps us improve, regardless of how this criticism is, how we're given this criticism. Maybe it's in front of others, and that's why we feel humiliated. So it's a wake-up call. But the other thing is that even if we reflect on ourselves and realize we haven't done anything wrong, well, it's still a reminder, because, well, maybe we've done something in the past, we've said something, done something that may have offended that person, who now then takes it upon themselves to humiliate us. So it reminds us that there's still work to be done in terms of our personal cultivation. There's a line in the Lao Tzu which asks us, reputation or self, which matters to one most? If our reputation is damaged, are we ourselves damaged? And the answer would be no, because, if we think about it, we still have the ability to improve ourselves, to make good on our ethical character, learn from our mistakes, and be willing to reflect on ourselves day in and day out, so that we know that we ourselves are making progress. There's a very good conversation in the Analects, and it's a conversation between Confucius and his student Sima Niu. And Sima Niu is actually a minister from the state of Song. His background is quite interesting because he's part of the aristocracy, And for many generations, his family have been ministers, government officials, so officials in that state. And at the time, his brothers are also officials. His older brother, because who's well favoured by the ruler of Song, decides to overthrow the government and set up a rebel kind of party. And Sima, all his other brothers actually support his older brother, Huan Tui. Sima, who's has left with no choice but to escape the state. And he travels to the state of Vulu, where he's able to study from Confucius. But he's got all of these anxieties. First of all, he's just left his home state. He's left his career, his source of income, his salary, his property, his family. What's going to happen? How is he going to survive? So he has that to worry about. But the other thing he's even more worried about is, ultimately when his brothers are arrested, when they are tried for treason, then will the rest of the family be implicated and also be punished? So he's worried about his own life. And, with all of these worries in his mind, he's asking Confucius here about how to be an exemplary person, how to do things in the right way, given the sort of difficult situation he finds himself in with, his family members like that. And Confucius, who's fully understanding of his background, replies by saying, well, an exemplary person is someone who has no worries and no fears. Sima then asks, really, is it that simple? That, no worries and no fears, and that's it? That's how you become an exemplary person? And Confucius then explains further. He says, well, if you look inside yourself, if you reflect on yourself, even if your conscience is clear, you've done your best, you've fulfilled your responsibilities, then what do you need to worry about and what do you need to fear? And that is the exemplary person. So you can see from Sima, his perspective, well, his different, has he fulfilled his responsibilities in his various relationships as a child, as a sibling? He tried to dissuade his brothers, but unsuccessfully. So he fulfilled that responsibility. As a minister to the state, he didn't take part in the coup to overthrow his ruler, but instead left. So he also fulfills that responsibility. So if he reflects on himself, he has a clear conscience. He hasn't done anything wrong there. And therefore, he doesn't need to have any worries. And so Confucius, in one line, addresses his anxieties and gives him that peace of mind to know that some things are out of our control, even if it's our closest family members, that you've done your best, and sometimes everyone's fate is in their own hands, and ours we only can really reflect on and change what we do. And if we can do that, then on a sort of sustained period, on an everyday basis, reflecting on ourselves, then this is the cultivation of an exemplary person. So this, getting back to that idea of suffering humiliation without resentment, if this humiliation is a false accusation, then we should still feel no resentment, because if we do cultivate, then and we do it on a daily basis, then it's just going to be a matter of time before people realize the truth, if they haven't already, that it is a false accusation, and if anything, it's a reminder for us to continue cultivating, that perhaps we need to continue improving ourselves. And so the exemplary person is not someone who never has any difficulties, but it's actually the person who, through their difficulties, forges their character. It's whether we can weather the storm and remain calm and clear-headed despite the adversities, and to meet those adversities with this equanimity, with a sense of giving, with a sense of forgiveness for others as well. And that's really the key to not only success in cultivating our virtue, but the key to success in our interactions. And so there are two really wonderful Chinese proverbs that I'd like to share with you. The first is, it tells us that, those who forgive are no fools, and a fool does not know how to forgive. So it's that idea of forgiveness that, really takes someone with a big heart who understands this virtue to be able to take a step back and not feel offended by humiliation. And the second one is, well, what happens when we find ourselves in that situation? First, withhold words. Don't speak too quickly because you might regret it. Don't lash out. Check one's temperature. Take a few deep breaths. Don't sort of think about that particular instant and your temper at that time. Swallow that anger, that pride. Forgive a wrong. So forgive and forget. And then take a step back. And realize that, the circumstances that we find ourselves in, count our blessings, give more and take less. And so these two lines, you can see, are very much interrelated, aren't they? That idea of giving more and taking less in our relationships helps us in maintain harmonious relationships. And, at times when they're far from harmonious, how do we preserve that? To suffer humiliation without any grudges, without any resentment, forgive and forget, and keep up our thoughts of the other person and thinking of their strengths rather than their weaknesses. So with that, I'll end on that note today. Thank you very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you very much.